Hello. As a resident of the Kilmore district, I've long been fascinated with the evidence of a long abandoned railway line that appears to wander its way around our local district. Recently, watching a video from the creators of Victorian Steam, it has inspired me to investigate where this line went from, where it went to, and what remains of it today. Please join me on this journey. Here I am at Summit, a crossing loop established in 1886 on the main line from Melbourne to Sydney. In 1888, the name was changed and a station established called Kilmore Junction. It remained as Kilmore Junction until 1922. The purpose of the junction was to provide a junction for the line that went from Kilmore Junction to Sandhurst, now Bendigo. A signal box was established here. It remained here until 1958. Then, with the construction of the standard gauge railway line in 1962, it was demolished and moved to the other side of the platform, where the fibro cement signal box remained until 1976, after the line's closure. The junction came off the main line and also entered from the Melbourne direction only. A run-off track was provided for when the line was set for trains going directly past the station. In 1922, the station name was changed to Heathcote Junction. This concrete footing was the site of the former station signal box. All that remains to indicate that the line used to be here was this plaque on a stone in the station. Another platform was provided here. For trains coming off the junction line. A little further on, there are remnants of the mounts for the signals and other associated signalling infrastructure. The railway line continued along and under a bridge which carried the Epping Wandong Road. Following the closure of the railway line in 1968, the Epping to Wandong Road was regraded, the bridge removed, and a large amount of spoil pushed up against the side of the road to obscure where the railway line once ran. However, on the other side, as history often leaves echoes from the past, there's evidence for us to find. Here is a large piece of concrete which appears to be part of the bridge structure, and that continues on to a large cutting through the small hill as the line continued on to where the Hume Highway now runs. Within the cutting there are also other evidence of railway infrastructure: sleepers, dog spikes and fish plates, probably along with ballast also. The line now goes through private properties. The railway line then passed through what is now private property into a suburb of Wandong. It then entered onto a high embankment which is now covered with pine trees and headed towards what is now the Hume Highway. The former railway formation to this point is marked by pine trees. I can only assume that the pine trees that were planted at the Heathcote Junction station, the seeds were dragged by the trains up the line, and due to the weed control operations, the trees never grew. Once train operations ceased, the pine trees grew from there. After leaving the town of Wandong, the railway line headed west, passing around behind the back of this building here, and continued now in a southerly direction along this earthen embankment. Crossing Arkell's Lane. The substantial earthworks that are found along the Heathcote Junction to Sandhurst line, along with the various cuttings, indicate that the construction of this line was no fly-by-night affair. At this point, the line has gone in a southerly direction back towards Melbourne. Here it passes through a farm property and is used as the farmer's road. The line continues on, then turns right to a large U-shape to the station of Leslie. Departing Leslie, trains turned north and continued on, entering this rather impressive cutting. Walking along the formation, you can feel and see the depressions in the ground where the sleepers were removed. At this point, Arkells Lane crossed over the railway cutting with a bridge. The original formation of the road was a zigzag and it passed over in the shortest possible way. Since closure of the line, the road has been regraded to go straight and the cutting filled in. There are still remnants of the bridge and piers here today. Arkells Lane as it originally was and as it exists today. Markings on the bridge abutment. Over to the other side. The railway cutting proceeding north again towards the next station of Bylands. Continuing north, the railway line passed along through farmlands, now which is used as this driveway, crossed over Unions Lane, and arrived at what is the Bylands railway station. This area has now been repurposed as the Tramway Heritage Centre. A departmental residence is still in existence behind where the station building stood. downgrade across a raised embankment, crossing McKirches Road and continuing towards Kilmore. The pylons that are visible were to hold the tramway line, or the tramway museum, which used to run trams for approximately 1 kilometre from their museum to McKirches Road. This has not been in operation for many years. This flattened area of farmland entering into a small cutting is the railway formation as it enters the township of Kilmore. It passes over the Kilmore-Wandong Road and is now heading into what is destined to become a housing development. The railway line continued through this housing estate on this orientation, crossing over Toodle Street here, through the Toyota car yard and to where the Toyota sign is, crossing the Northern Highway, which in 1968 was the Hume Highway. This hump in the Northern Highway at the intersection of Broadhurst Street is the original railway crossing from what was the Hume Highway in 1968. The railway line came from approximately the right of the Toyota sign across into what is now the Ford car yard and proceeded to the left-hand corner of the Mitre 10 store. Continuing on, the line passed through what is now the Mitre 10 yard and paralleled Hamilton Street. All these recent houses have now been built on what was formerly the railway formation. The line continued on across the open land in the far distance to where the trees are in the centre view. Once trains had entered the Kilmore township, they passed along behind houses that faced onto the main road. It then came through this paddock, which was the former site of the St Patrick's Primary School in Kilmore, temporary site, and then continued on to the station area. This area is about to be redeveloped into housing, and thus any remnants of the railway line will be lost. From the earthworks, railway ballast can still be seen, and in amongst the trees is a former buffer stop. Also at Kilmore, at some point, was a turntable for either turning locomotives or rail motors. The remnants of the concrete remains here today. Undoubtedly this will be removed when the housing development occurs. And here is the other end of the turntable. Obviously not a very long turntable, so possibly just for turning rail motors. Continuing back into the station yard area. Pine trees which must be nearly 100 years old. The railway yard was set out in the depression, as you can see here. The line that continued on towards Willowmavin has now been occupied by the CFA. The railway yard, I believe, consisted of 3 tracks with a good siding on the western side. The station building was a wooden structure with the veranda and refreshment rooms. After the line's closure in 1968, it is believed that the station building was demolished along with the platform, and all the remnants bulldozed into what is these mounds here. There are still pieces of concrete and other structural material which potentially were from the station building. This is still called Railway Street to this day. And remnants of potentially a standpipe. The railway line then continued through what is now the Kilmore Primary School towards Willowmavin. Trains departed from Kilmore Station, then proceeded in a down direction through this area, of which very little of the line remains, and curved round towards the left near where the shipping containers are into what is now Willowmavin Estate. This line of diagonal pine trees very clearly mark where the railway line ran on its way out towards Willowmavin, from a small cutting to a raised embankment in the far distance. After passing through what is now the Willowmavin housing estate, the line came out here, passing through a very shallow cutting which is still evident. The line continued on to a built-up embankment further down. It is very distinctly marked by this diagonal line of pine trees. The line now crossed Lee Street here, next to this dam, and heading out down the paddocks towards Kings Lane and Willowmavin Road. Traversing farmland between Lees Road and Kings Lane, the railway line was supported by this small earthen hump, which is a little difficult to discern amongst the grasslands. It then crossed Kings Lane and Willowmavin Road, again heading towards Willowmavin. After crossing the Willowmavin Road at Kings Lane, the line passed across flat farming land, curving around to the left, then proceeding upgrade slightly to a small cutting at Mooney's Lane, which has now been filled in with large boulders to regrade the road. Crossing the road, it continued upgrade towards Willowmavin Station. On this property next to the Willowmavin Road is the remains of the Willowmavin railway station. After passing Boundary Road at Willowmavin, the line continued along further through farmland on virtually flat ground, making its position fairly difficult to discern. There's a slight rise here at Allens Road and some sleepers and some other railway evidence. The line then continued on through open country towards Wandong. The Wandong railway station existed here at the intersection of the Wandong Road and Tubarak Court. railway line headed this way, coming from the south, crossed the road and continued onwards towards High Camp, again through private farmland. This was the former station yard of High Camp. It involved the main line next to the platform and a loop track next to a goods platform here. Also, some pieces of concrete can be observed which were presumably from the station structures. On the other side of Crawford's Road, adjacent to the main line, was a spur track, and still remaining is a 1890 to 1924 style buffer without 1955's modifications. Immediately after Crawford's Road at High Camp, there seems to be some timber platform edging and what appears to be a loading platform of some description. After leaving High Camp station, the line continuing towards Pyalong upon a large embankment up towards the Northern Highway. In the 1970s, the Northern Highway was realigned and the railway crossing regraded. After crossing the Northern Highway, of which the redevelopment has pushed most of the spoil onto the railway formations, the train would now enter a very large cutting before levelling out onto some more built-up embankments and heading downgrade towards Pyalong. After exiting the cutting, the line then rises up on a large embankment, heading slightly downgrade into another cutting where it crosses the Northern Highway again at Fullards Road. After traversing a series of cuttings and embankments, the train now crossed the Northern Highway again here at Fullards Road. From the Fullards Road crossing, the line continues on this way. Approaching from Mirandang and prior to arriving at Pyalong is the Percival Creek trestle bridge. This bridge is possibly the best conditioned bridge still remaining on the line. From here the line crosses over the Northern Highway again and around the large hill behind Pyalong township and heads towards the Mollison Creek trestle bridge. When the train arrived at Pyalong, it did so by sweeping around in a large arc around the back of the hill from the Pyalong township. It is very difficult to observe where the line used to run, although as you can see a small embankment halfway up the hill as the train descended to the Turners Creek trestle bridge. The Mollison Creek trestle bridge at Pyalong is by far the most impressive structure of the railway line still remaining. Unfortunately, it is in a very poor state of repair. Apparently it was recommended for historic preservation. Unfortunately, the funds that were allocated supposedly have not been spent on it, and it is in risk of falling down or being demolished in the next few years. All pedestrian access has been now restricted. This is the bridge deck of the Mollison Creek trestle bridge at Pyalong. Many of the crossing timbers have now broken and fallen through, and there is no ballast remaining on the bridge deck itself. The line continued along this way towards the station on a high embankment, where it crossed another trestle bridge over the Pyalong Seymour Road. This bridge no longer exists. This is the site of the former Pyalong railway station, possibly one of the largest on the line, which included having 5 tracks and a dedicated goods track and small yard over on the other side. It occupies quite a large area of the Pyalong township. The council has now chose to use it as their transfer station. The line continued along what is now called Ladder Hill Road. The extensive earthworks to make this rather simple country road do not seem indicative of what a Shire council would be prepared to put into such a piece of infrastructure. So they just laid the road over the existing railway line. A cutting in Ladder Hill Road, Pyalong. And looking back towards the station. Ladder Hill Road ends and deviates back up towards the Northern Highway, while the railway line continues onwards with a curve to the right through farmlands as it heads towards the next station of Tubarak. The railway line continues upgrade from Pyalong, past over McMaster's Road, up to Basin Hill Road, where it enters a small cutting and crosses over the road. The local farmer has filled in this end of the cutting and also on the other side of the cutting. The line is still continuing towards Tubarak. After leaving Basin Hill Road, the railway line came through a cutting in this hill, along this embankment, and proceeded along a high embankment to another cutting. The line now parallels the Northern Highway again, sitting on a raised embankment. Here passing over a small gully where no doubt another trestle bridge once stood. This is just prior to entering the township of Tubarak. After entering Tubarak township, the station yard exists here. This is all that remains of it. Still here though is what appears to be a 1920s style departmental residence, which potentially could have belonged to the station master. Leaving Tubarak station, the line rose up and crossed a trestle bridge over the Seymour Tubarak Road. Coming from Tubarak, the line cuts a straight angle across the side of the hill on the far side of McIvers Creek. As it heads towards the Northern Highway crossing. After continuing on the eastern side of the Northern Highway, following the McIver Creek Valley, the line passed through a small cutting along here through this paddock, crossing the Northern Highway here and continuing on towards Heathcote. Now on the west side of the Northern Highway, the line rises up on a small embankment across a trestle bridge and continues on towards Peters Gully Road. After crossing the Northern Highway again, the line continued on over Peters Gully Road and continued on towards Shorts Lane. The train continued on a low embankment between these fence lines across Joe's Road, then over a small creek where evidence of a small trestle bridge still remains. It then continued on to where the station of Argyle was. Continuing from Pete's Gully Road, the train crossed across Shorts Lane and continued on towards Heathcote. This farm driveway is being placed on the formation. The trains coming from Tubarak came through this freight yard area, approximately where the Argyle station must have been, across Dairy Flat Lane and onto the track, which has now been regraded as a road. The railway formation, still being paved over as a road, continued on over Spring Flat Road and around to the right through cuttings through some large boulders. The line, still coming from the south, starts to go on a slight upgrade on an embankment, crossing a small creek where evidence of another trestle bridge still remains, and the embankment on the other side. Some industrial sites were built on the line after it passed Hassel's Lane. It then continued on and has been resurfaced as a road called Matthews Lane. This is heading from Melbourne. The train, after crossing Hassan's Lane, crossed over Pink Cliffs Road and continued along here behind the hospital through a reasonable cutting lined with pine trees. The train, now in the Heathcote township, passed through the pine tree lined cutting at the rear of the Heathcote Hospital and passed out over Harriet Street into this large area which was the station yard. This is now the beginning of the O'Keefe Rail Trail, which proceeds on to Bendigo. It is unlikely that the rail trail will be extended back towards Heathcote Junction, as the railway formation has been sold off and is now privately owned. This is where my journey ends, and if you've watched so far, thank you for your patience. I'm also grateful and appreciate the ability to use and hopefully correctly credit the photographs that I have embedded in this video. The photographers, Des Jarlett, Keith Anderson, David Watson, Graham Kaufman, Les Brown, were people who obviously were insightful to know that they were witnessing the end of an important part of railway history and history of our state, and did their utmost to record it for future generations. And for that we should all be very grateful. I hope you have enjoyed this trip down memory lane along the former Heathcote Junction to Heathcote railway line. Farewell.